A German Shepherd mother staggered out of a Helena, Montana blizzard, cradling her pup against the cold. Her leg broken and her coat crusted with frost. And old hurt, she was not supposed to survive the night. But on that empty road, a Marine saw her lifted both lives into his arms and chose to fight the storm instead of walk past it. By morning in town, whispers spread a hidden ring of cruelty in the woods, and a community about to learn what courage looks like when it limps but won't quit. What follows will break your heart, then stitch it back together with hope. It's a story of a warrior dog, a stubborn pup, and a man who refused to lose anyone ever again. Before we begin, where are you watching from? Drop your country in the comments below. And if you believe no human or animal should be left behind in the cold, hit subscribe. This one might restore your faith in miracles. Snow blew sideways across Helena, Montana, turning Last Chance Gulch into a pale river of air, and erasing the world down to breath wind and the rasp of ice on asphalt. The January sky sagged low and pewter over the valley. Plows had passed hours ago, leaving ribbed berms that gleamed like the backs of sleeping whales. Now even those were being devoured by the white. Streetlights along Prospect Avenue fizzed in their own halos, and the pines beyond the guardrail lifted heavy, stoic arms against the gale. On the two-lane road that threaded the foothills toward the North Hills trailhead, a man moved through the storm with the deliberate economy of someone who had learned to count on his own momentum when machines failed and radios went quiet. This was Ethan Ward, 42-year-old male, tall and lean, athletic build, handsome yet weathered side part, dark brown hair with subtle gray at the temples, light stubble, beard, steel blue eyes, strong jawline, calm, thoughtful expression, wearing a single U.S. Marine woodland green camo uniform, Marpat woodland utility blouse and trousers, sleeves neatly rolled clean but slightly worn, fabric texture, no patches or logos, no insignia. Rugged coyote brown Marine combat boots laced and lightly scuffed. No cap, no hat, no helmet. And the storm made a soft drum of his ribs, while it gnawed the heat from his ears and knuckles. He walked because the truck behind him had died in a cough, a fuel-starved breath and a flash of dashboard lights, and because standing still in cold like this teaches a quick lesson about endings. He walked because walking had kept him alive before long ago in a world away when night in Helman came barbat, and the wind brought sand that stitched itself into your eyelids. The first wrongness was color, a thread of rust. Dark beads strewn across the plow's guard shoulder, stark against the moon-pale drift. The second was shape, a collapsed shadow tucked into the lee of a mile marker, as if the storm itself had grown tired and folded down to rest. He veered toward it without thinking, boots punching through a crust of refrozen slurry. The beads resolved into blood clotted to black cherries in the cold. The shadow resolved into two bodies fused by instinct. The larger one was a German Shepherd mother, 5 or 6 years by her teeth, and the toughened, slightly dulled sheen of her coat. Her frame rangy, but starved thin ribs alphanumeric beneath the fur. She was classic saddle and tan, but winter had frosted the saddle into charcoal, and a dozen white flecks clung to her lashes. One foreleg lay angled wrong beneath her chest, swelling brutal and bright under matted hair. Along her left flank, old scars crisscrossed like a cartographer's bad map. Her ears trembled toward him and back again, caught between fear and the reflex to guard. Her eyes, amber-edged with a pin of green, tracked his center line as he came close, then closer, then dropped to the small weight she held against her sternum with the muscle of her whole body. The smaller was a puppy, maybe 5 months, the kind that still wore its paws too big and its expression too honest. He was pale tan, washed with a young saddle, a single ear perfectly upright, while the other, charmingly disobedient, had folded at the tip. A dark smudge marked his muzzle like he'd been nosing in charcoal. A raw stripe showed at his right hip where fur had been scraped away. He shivered without rhythm and made small noises that were questions asked in a language older than any man's. The mother made no sound. She had rearranged herself into architecture, a wall, a roof, a door he would have to knock on. He knelt, hands visible, and open winds strafed the ditch with needles. The puppy blinked, as if each gust wrote something new on the world. He spoke low voice pitched to the intimate register that lives somewhere between a prayer and a field report. "I see you," he said to the mother. "I see what you're doing." She watched him without blinking, chest working shallow under the weight of the little one. Up close, the stink of old blood and salt and fear sat in the air like another presence. He could see dirt ground into the webbing between her toes, recent travel hurried and rough. He could see the crude abrasion where a rope or chain had worried the skin at her neck, the hair rubbed short and scaly. He could see decisions being made behind her eyes, tally marks of calculations, threat, resource, pain. He tapped 2 fingers against his own sternum and found his name as if reintroducing himself to a long estranged part of his life. Ethan, he did not reach for her yet. "You do not reach into another soldier's perimeter without asking." He turned his palm toward the wind so she could smell what the storm was smearing across his skin. Cedar soap, diesel ghost old coffee, the clean Ferris note of snow. The puppy sniffed first an inquisitive feather of breath, then licked where the wind had left his knuckles cracked. Only then did the mother shift, barely. The movement so small, the snow tried to erase it as it happened. She lifted her head, and the muscle along her jaw trembled with the effort. She placed her chin across the puppy's shoulder, like a hand placed gently on a child's back in church. "Okay," he said. "Okay." The road whispered emptiness behind him. Beyond the guardrail, the valley ran away under white sheets, dotted with black punctuation. Juniper's fence posts, the occasional bale of hay, 3/4 buried, and wearing a hat. Far off Helena's lights made an amber bruise under the clouds. He thought of how light looked from a medevac bird once, the way camp would bloom up out of a black map. And you might, if you were lucky, imagine that meant safety. He shrugged out of his rucksack and found the emergency blanket, the mylar crackling loud as a snapped wishbone. The puppy startled. The mother did not. She held his eyes and simply endured the noise. Like she had endured everything that had brought her to the mile marker's lead. He slid the blanket under them in stages, slipping, pausing, narrating each small invasion as if language could make trespass into permission. The blanket flashed dull gold when it caught a sliver of streetlight. The wind worried its edges and turned them into wings. Heat is a conversation, not a gift. He wrapped the blanket around the pair so it made a shallow bowl and tucked the bowl into himself. Shoulders curved, thighs braced, arms making a soft armor. The first contact of her body against his coat sent a shock up his sternum. Not from cold, but from the way memory travels bone to bone. In another country, he had been the one folded around a not-quite-brisami breathing friend while rotors stitched the night. He had counted down with the medic while watching the medic's mouth instead of the watch, because human lips can tell time better when seconds get heavy. He had failed once, a boy named Delaney, who had a laugh like a door slamming happily, and a habit of carrying 2 extra tourniquets like talismans, and the failure had set like a fracture that never quite knit. The snow tried to fill the shape that the 3 of them made. He let it up to a point. Snow is an insulator if you make it work for you instead of against you. He checked the mother's paw pads with fingers so gentle they felt borrowed. The sprain on the foreleg wasn't just a sprain. There was a sharp tide of swelling below the joint, the skin hot even in this air, a heat that spoke of inflammation and the beginnings of something bad. If time was allowed to do what time loves to do. He looked at the puppy's hip. The abrasion was clean, no bristling edges of infection yet, but the skin was raw enough that every gust had to hurt like a word said deliberately unkind. "You've done good," he told the mother, and the phrase was clumsy but true. She blinked once, slow, as if the compliment were a thing she did not have a cupboard for. He thought of names, because names are bridges. "Grace," he said to her, tasting the vowel in the back of his mouth where the air was still warm. It felt like the right word for a creature who had made shelter from her body. The puppy nosed his wrist again, enthusiast puffing in fog. "And you," he said, "you're a chance someone took." He said the last without thinking, and because he had said it, it was so. Chance wiggled once and tucked himself bluntly between Ethan's ribs and the mother's flank. The way the young wedge themselves into the world and expect it to make room. The wind shifted. Somewhere down the slope, a plow roared. The Doppler moan of blade against asphalt and light skimmed the far trees like a thrown coin. He calculated distance and time and the geography of pain. The truck was a quarter-mile back, nose buried in a small dune of plow leavings. The truss bridge over Prickly Pear Creek was another half-mile forward. Beyond that, if he could keep them moving. A service station's fluorescent hum and a payphone that usually ate quarters, but sometimes remembered its job. He could carry 1 body. 2 with a ruck, and a storm would turn into a physics lesson about thresholds he did not want to learn again. He thought of what a squad leader once told him on a day when the radio went to static and the plan came apart in his palms. "Make a small plan and out-stubborn the universe." "Listen," he said to Grace, because speaking kept his breath steady. "We're going to stand up together. I'm going to take him first just for 40 steps and come back for you." 40. "If I do 40 twice, we're over the rise and out of the worst of the wind." He slid out from the mylar bowl in inches and gathered the puppy against his chest under the coat, tucking the cold nose into the hollow where shoulder becomes collarbone. The puppy made the hiccuping sound of a tiny engine catching. He stood joints complaining, and immediately the wind found his heat and tried to evict it. He set his boots where the berm was firmest, and counted the steps in a low cadence. 4 by 4, hush of breath 12. 26, 37, 40. He knelt set Chance into the lee of a drift, covered him back with the shining blanket's corner, so he looked comically like a foil-wrapped present, and jogged back toward the mile marker with his hands open again to show the mother he was returning. The second trip felt like a conversation with his own legs about responsibility and limits. He gathered Grace with an arm under her chest, and another cradling the broken foreleg against his body to keep it from jarring. She was not small, but there is a way that bodies made to protect become light when someone else takes guard duty. She relaxed into the carry with a kind of dignified surrender that felt like trust. And trust, he had learned, is heavier to hold than muscle. He made his 40, then set her down beside the puppy, then made another 40 with the puppy again. In this manner, like a tide moving 2 shells along a beach, a leap-frogged mercy, they inch the distance. The bridge materialized out of the white like architecture remembering itself. The creek below ran a dark ribbon with frilled edges, black noise under the wind's white noise. He took a knee in the knee of the east abutment and let his breath write ghosts into the air until the ghosts settled. Grace put her muzzle against Chance's forehead and exhaled a tired blessing. In the shelter of the concrete, he checked them both, again fingers quick and sure, now that a small plan had become a path. Frost salted Grace's whiskers. Chance's one floppy ear had caked to a curl with ice. He told them about the gas station lights beyond the next bend, about the space heater that clicked and hummed by the door, about the styrofoam cups and the hot water that could be persuaded out of a grudging tap. He told them about a woman named Clara Whitmore who owed him nothing and would help anyway, though he did not yet know her name, only the hope of her. And as he spoke, the winds seemed to listen, as if weather itself respected a man whose promises were small, exact, and kept. He felt an old ache rise hot against the cold, the shape of Delaney's laugh, and the useless weight of a tourniquet never used. He set it down the way you set down a pack when the straps have cut you bloody. "Not today," he said into Grace's amber eyes. "I don't lose anyone today." Snow swirled, seeking hollows, smoothing edges that did not need smoothing. He gathered the puppy once more, felt the beat of a small heart, rapid and insistent against his palm, and prepared to lift the mother again. The storm pressed around them like a crowd leaning into here. Behind the hill, the low sodium glow of the service station painted the undersides of the clouds the softest, most improbable gold. The storm was unrelenting, the kind that devoured sound and sense alike, reducing the world to the sting of ice against skin and the groan of bending trees. Ethan Ward pushed forward, his breath already ragged from carrying 2 lives and staggered relays from the road. The GermanShepherd mother, whom he had silently named Grace, hung heavily in his arms, her body trembling against his chest. The pup, Chance, was bundled beneath his camouflage coat, a warm, squirming weight pressed into his ribs. His boots punched through knee-high snow, each step carved out by the sheer will of someone who had promised himself there would be no more losses on his watch. Through the blur of sleep, he spotted the faded outline of an old highway rest stop, a squat concrete shell abandoned years ago when the interstate had been rerouted. Its sign was half torn away, the letters ST still clinging like stubborn survivors above a doorway drifted half shut with snow. He kicked through the crust and shouldered the door. The hinges groaned, but gave, spilling them into stale, shadowed air, tinged with old fuel and dust. The place was a single rectangular room, with cracked tile floors, broken vending machines hunched like forgotten relics, and a row of benches scarred with graffiti. The wind whistled through a shattered window pane, but at least the walls cut the worst of the cold. Ethan lowered Grace gently onto a blanket he yanked from his rucksack, arranging her so her broken foreleg was cushioned. Chance wriggled free of his coat, shook once, and then promptly collapsed against his mother's flank, with a sigh. Ethan worked methodically the way men train for crisis always do. From his pack, he produced a steel canteen sloshing with what little water remained and a field ration bar wrapped in silver foil. He cracked the bar, chewing a piece himself and breaking another into crumbs small enough for Chance's young teeth. The pup chewed obediently each bite, an act of faith. Grace refused food, her eyes heavy with exhaustion, but when he offered her water, she lapped weakly, the effort costing her a groan. He tore strips from an undershirt and wrapped them gently around her swollen leg, his big hands uncharacteristically tender. He scoured the room for anything useful and found an old metal trash can in the corner. Its sides were dented graffiti, scrawled and looping ink, but it would serve. He dragged it to the center of the room, piled inside splintered pieces of benchwood, and struck his flint. It took patience coaxing the stubborn spark into flame, feeding it with paper peeled from a half-rotted road atlas left behind on a bench. Soon fire flickered inside the can, painting the walls, and gold throwing warmth into the room like a promise kept. The light fell over Grace's worn body, and Chance's small frame over Ethan's camouflage knees, where he crouched to keep watch. And it made them, for a moment, look like a family assembled out of storm and ash. The crackle of fire pulled something else out of him memory. He found himself staring into the flames and seeing not timber, but sand. A desert night, a sky bleeding orange under a storm of grit that filled lungs and weapons alike. He was back in Afghanistan, caught in the chaos of a sudden ambush where the wind carried dust like razors and visibility shrank to nothing. His unit had huddled in a ruined compound, one wall blown open to the storm, the other shaking with mortar impact. He remembered the taste of metal in his teeth. The screams cut short, and Delaney's hands slipping from his own beneath the weight of collapsed stone. Delaney had shielded him in that moment, his laugh gone silent forever, his promise to see Montana again never fulfilled. Ethan closed his eyes, his chest tightening as if the storm outside had pressed itself into his lungs. He had carried that guilt for years, the failure etched deeper than any scar. And now here in the hush of an abandoned rest stop, he saw Grace curled around her pup the way Delaney had curled around him. A creature refusing to yield to the cold because another life depended on it. The sight tore something loose inside him. He reached out and laid his hand on Grace's head, stroking between her ears. Her amber eyes opened briefly, and he whispered, "Not this time. Not you. Not him. I won't let the storm take you." Chance, hearing the low voice, lifted his floppy ear and gave a tiny bark, as if adding his own vow. Ethan chuckled, despite himself, the sound a rough break in the stillness. He shifted to sit against the wall fire, between them and the wind. He pulled his coat tighter, letting fatigue creep into his bones, but his eyes never left Grace and Chance. As hours dragged, the storm roared outside, rattling the cracked windows and whistling through every gap. Snow hissed against the walls like sand once had against desert stone, and it fused the two memories into one. Ethan thought of the promise he had failed to keep then, and the promise he would keep now. He thought of how fragile life is, how it demands both stubbornness and grace to survive. When dawn began to bleed faint gray through the broken glass, Ethan rose stiffly. Grace lifted her head weaker, but still alive, her breath visible in the faint warmth of the fire. Chance stretched, yawned, and immediately clambered over his mother's body to nose Ethan's boot. Outside, the storm had abated, leaving the landscape a quiet, blank sheet of white. It was time to move, but in that moment before he packed his things and gathered the dogs, Ethan placed one hand against his chest, over the scar tissue memory had left, and repeated softly to himself, "No more losses. Not today, not ever again." By morning, the storm had dwindled to silence, leaving Helena cloaked in a deceptive calm. The roads were sheets of ice beneath a thin powder of snow, and the mountains loomed in crystalline blue light. Ethan Ward trudged along the edge of the main highway, Grace limping beside him on 3 legs, her broken forelimb cradled in a makeshift sling he had fashioned from strips of cloth. Chance rode inside Ethan's coat again, only his floppy ears sticking out, twitching at every sound. Each step toward town was measured and deliberate. His boots crunched over ice crusts, his breath clouding into the cold morning air. For the first time since the previous night, He allowed himself to believe they might all survive this. Helena at dawn had the look of a painting streets muffled by snow roofs capped white and chimneys releasing ribbons of smoke that rose into the brittle sky. People were already stirring bundled figures with shovels clearing stoops, the glow of a diner on the corner spilling coffee-scented warmth onto the sidewalk. Ethan led the dogs into town, shoulders squared, posture unmistakable as someone trained to stand tall even when weary. Conversations hushed as he passed. Not because anyone recognized him, but because the sight of a battered German Shepherd mother hobbling at his side and a pup blinking from his coat was something out of the ordinary. The veterinary clinic stood on the corner of Main in 5th, a single-story building painted cream with a faded blue awning. Its sign, hand-lettered decades ago, read, "Whitmore Veterinary Care. Inside the air smelled faintly of antiseptic and hay." Posters of smiling dogs and cats curled on the walls faded at the edges by years of sun. The waiting area was lined with worn chairs, and the counter was stacked with clipboards, a jar of biscuits, and a bell that tinkled as Ethan pushed the door open. Dr. Clara Whitmore emerged from a back room with the quick, purposeful stride of someone long accustomed to emergencies. She was in her early 40s, tall and willowy, her blonde hair streaked with gray and twisted into a loose bun. Her face carried the gentle fatigue of someone who gave more of herself than she ever asked in return, and her hazel eyes, though kind, bore shadows that suggested many nights spent awake over suffering animals. Clara wore a moss-green cardigan over a cream blouse and dark slacks, practical flat shoes, squeaking slightly on the tile. She paused when she saw Ethan, Grace, and Chance, then moved without hesitation, her voice low and calm. "Set her here," Clara said, gesturing to a padded table. "And let's get that pup looked at, too." Ethan obeyed silently, lifting Grace onto the table with both arms, careful not to jar her injured leg. The dog whined once, but remained still, eyes flicking between Ethan and Clara, as though weighing which one she could trust. Chance wriggled out of Ethan's coat and patted to the table's base tail, wagging nervously. Clara's hands moved with practiced precision. She palpated Grace's swollen foreleg, her fingers light but sure, before stepping back with a frown. Broken upper radius, maybe ulna, too. She'll need splinting at least, maybe pins later if infection sets in. She traced the scars that crisscrossed the shepherd's body, old welts that no accident could explain. And these, her jaw tightened. These aren't from the wild, Ethan watched, steel blue eyes narrowing. "What do you mean?" Clara met his gaze. "Scars from ropes, from lashes. I've seen this before dogfighting." Chance barked sharply as if in protest. Clara bent, scooping him gently into her arms. The pup was light, hardly more than 20 pounds, his ribs faintly visible under soft fur. She examined his right hip, noting the raw scrape and tenderness there. "This one's luckier, just bruising and abrasion. No fracture." She stroked his floppy ear, her expression softening. "Sweet little thing." The bell at the front door chimed again. A man entered, stomping snow from his boots. He was Arthur Mills, one of the locals, a stocky man in his late 50s wearing a patched wool coat and a cape dusted white. His piece was ruddy from years of work outdoors, his beard gray and trimmed close. He paused when he saw the shepherd on Clara's table. "Lord above," he muttered. "That's one of them, isn't it?" Clara's brow furrowed. "One of what, Arthur?" Arthur lowered his voice, though Ethan still caught every word. "The fighting dogs. Folks been whispering for months now, strange howls up in the logging camps. Men coming down from the hills with more cash than honest work explains. Sheriff never found proof, but that one," he nodded at Grace. "She's been through it." Grace stirred ears, twitching, as if she understood the weight of the words. Ethan rested a hand on her shoulder, steadying her. "She's mine now," he said, voice calm but firm. "And no one's taking her or the pup." Clara met his eyes again. There was no challenge in her gaze, only respect. "Then let's make sure she lives long enough for that promise." She moved briskly, gathering bandages, splinting material, and antiseptic. Ethan stood by, holding Grace steady while Clara worked. The shepherd bore the manipulation without a snap or snarl, her trust surprising even herself. Chance whines softly circling at Ethan's feet until he scooped the pup into his free arm. The clinic grew quiet, except for the sounds of Clara's careful work and the occasional shuffle of Arthur's boots as he hovered by the door. Outside, Helena's morning life went on. Cars crunching on salted roads, shopkeepers lifting shutters. But within those walls, the world narrowed to one soldier, one veterinarian, and 2 dogs bound together by accident and survival. When the splint was finished, Grace lay still, panting but calmer, her amber eyes heavy with exhaustion. Clara wiped her hands, exhaling softly. "She'll need rest and proper medicine I don't have in this little clinic, but she's stronger than most." She looked at Ethan. "So are you, by the look of it. You brought her in alive through that storm. That's no small thing." Ethan gave a short nod. Words were not his habit, but the slight lift at the corner of his mouth was as close to gratitude as most would ever see. Arthur tugged at his cap. "Best keep watch, Sergeant. If she did escape one of them camps, someone might come sniffing. Men who run fights don't like losing their property." Ethan's hand tightened briefly on Grace's fur, his steel blue eyes cooling into a soldier's stare. Then they'll find she's not theirs anymore. And in the hush that followed, Clara caught something unspoken but unmistakable. The vow of a man who had carried loss for years and refused to let it claim anything more. The air in Helen has sharpened after the storm, cold enough to make each breath sting the lungs and turn the world into a canvas of white and shadow. The snow had hardened overnight into a crust that crunched beneath Ethan Ward's boots as he left town and followed the faint trail that had been haunting him since morning. He had not intended to go back out so soon. Grace was still weak. Her splinted leg swaddled and Clara's careful work, and Chance had curled up at her side and the clinic's recovery pen. But something in the scars Clara had uncovered demanded answers. The soldier in him could not leave a battlefield half-mapped. The trail began at the edge of the timberline north of town. Faint, rust-colored blotches broke the perfection of the snow. A breadcrumb path written in blood and paw prints. Ethan moved quietly, his tall frame blending into the trees. The green-brown of his camouflage utilities strangely at home against the dark pines and the frozen earth peeking through the drifts. He held a small camera in one gloved hand. A tool borrowed from Clara's clinic office. She had pressed it into his palm with a look that said more than words. "Find the truth." The forest was hushed, as though listening. Black-barked trunks stood like sentinels, and the wind threaded through them with a mournful whistle. Ethan moved deeper senses alive, each sound measured against the catalogue of noises he had learned to survive by. Branches cracking snow, shifting the hollow thud of his own heartbeat. After an hour, the trees opened onto a small clearing, and there it was. The remnants of a logging camp long abandoned. The cabin's sagged inward roofs bent under years of snow. But what marked the place was an age. It was use. Around the central yard, heavy iron stakes had been driven into the ground, chains still bolted to them, their links frosted stiff. Wooden posts bore grooves where ropes had rubbed, and in one corner lay a pit dug into the earth. Its edges black with old blood now frozen in macabre permanence. The air smelled faintly of iron and rot, even beneath the clean bite of pine. Ethan crouched, lifted his camera, and snapped frame after frame. The chains, the pit, the collapsed lean-to, stacked with crude wooden muscles and lash marks carved into planks. A sound behind him made him stiffen. He pivoted hand, going instinctively to his belt, though he carried no weapon today. He had left it in Clara's office. A deliberate act to calm the townsfolk who eyed him warily. What stood in the snow was not a man, but Chance the puppy. His tan body bounding clumsily through the drifts. The scrape on his hip had slowed him, and he limped slightly, but still he came. Tail tucked and eyes wide. Chance. Ethan muttered a mix of exasperation and something softer. He knelt as the pup trotted the last few feet, collapsing against his knees with a whine. The soldier scooped him up, feeling the shiver of the small body through his. Gloves. Chance lifted his mismatched ears and stared into his face with an intensity that words could never manage. In those hazel eyes, Ethan saw a plea playing his speech. Don't leave us. He let out a long breath, the cold turning it into steam. He remembered nights on patrol when he had told his men to trust him, when their lives had depended on his judgment, when failure had written itself into the ground with blood. Looking down at the pup, Ethan realized that same responsibility had followed him home, reshaped in fur and trembling ribs. He touched Chance's head gently. I hear you, he said. I'm not going anywhere. The wind rose, scattering snow into the clearing. Ethan pulled his camera again, angling one last photograph of the pit, then tucked it away. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small flip phone. Its screen scratched from years of use, service bar flickering weakly. He dialed the number Clara had scribbled for him earlier that morning. Sheriff Logan Pierce. The line crackled, then a steady voice answered. Logan Pierce. 35-year-old male, tall, lean runners build with broad shoulders. Face clean shave and square jaw, calm gray blue eyes, straight nose, steady thoughtful expression. Hair short, brown hair with tapered sides and a slightly tousled top. Skin light sun-kissed tone, wearing one consistent U.S. Police Navy patrol uniform. Fitted Navy duty shirt with epaulets and concealed nameplate. No readable text. Matching Navy tactical trousers. Black duty belt with holster handcuffs, radio, and shoulder mic. Polished black leather duty boots. Was known in Helena as a man who had chosen patience over power and fairness over fear. Years earlier, he had lost his younger brother to an unsolved hit and run. The grief had carved something permanent in him, a refusal to let silence bury the truth. Pierce came his voice. Curt, but not unkind. This is Ward, Ethan said, keeping his tone even. I've found something in the North Woods you'll want to see. Chains pits blood dog fighting, if I'm not mistaken. There was a pause filled only by static. Then Logan spoke again, voice colder now. Send me the pictures, stay put, but stay safe. I'll bring a team. I won't stay long, Ethan replied. His gaze on Chance, who blinked up at him with stubborn devotion. But you'll have what you need. He snapped the phone shut, slipped it back into his pocket, and gave the clearing one final look. As he turned to leave, Chance limped beside him, each small step unsteady but determined. Ethan slowed his stride so the pup could keep pace. Snowflakes clung to the puppy's whiskers, and when he stumbled into a drift, Ethan reached down and lifted him, cradling him against his chest. The pup's heartbeat thudded fast and frantic, echoing Ethan's own. The soldier's chest tightened in a way he hadn't felt in years. The storm had not only stripped the land bare, it had stripped something raw inside him. In that fragile clearing with chains rattling in the wind and a pup's eyes locked on his, Ethan realized his heart. Long thought frozen was thawing, and thawing hurts before it heals. With Chance tucked safe against him, Ethan walked back through the pines, leaving behind the secret scar of Helena's forest, but carrying with him proof enough to drag it into daylight. The storm had eased, but the night brought with it a stillness that felt heavier than the wind. Snow lay like a quilt over Helena, muffling every sound, except the crackle of ice shifting on rooftops. Ethan Ward's cabin, perched on the outskirts of town near the first rise of the North Hills, stood small against the vastness. It was a 2-room wooden structure with smoke-blackened rafters and a wood stove at its heart. Inside, a single lantern glowed weakly, throwing golden circles against log walls lined with old marine photos, metals boxed away, and books that bore the dust of years. Grace lay stretched on a wool blanket beside the stove. Her chest rose and fell unevenly, each breath a rough climb. Sweat darkened the fur around her neck, despite the winter chill, and her eyes, usually alert, were glazed with fever. The splinted leg trembled at intervals, pain riding her body like an unwanted rider. Chance curled against her ribs, his small form pressed close, as if proximity alone could heal. Ethan knelt nearby, one knee on the rough pine floor, a damp cloth in his hand that he used to dab at Grace's forehead and ear. He had seen fever like this before. In Afghanistan, he had watched young men burn with infection after shrapnel tore skin and dirt found blood. He had seen the body's own fire consume its host. Those memories pressed hard against him as he listened to Grace's ragged breaths. She was a warrior, her body crisscrossed with the scars of survival. But even warriors fell when the fever claimed them. Ethan's features sharp, and weathered softened as he leaned closer. His steel blue eyes flickered with something rarely seen in them: helplessness. He set the cloth aside, pressing his hand gently against Grace's flank, grounding himself in her trembling warmth. "Hold on, soldier," he whispered, voice rough with fatigue. "I need you. Don't go dark on me now." The cabin was quiet, except for the stove's occasional sigh and the rattle of wind at the shutters. Ethan kept vigil. His broad shoulders hunched, his lean frame showing the toll of sleepless nights. Memories pressed into the silence, Delaney's voice laughing over a card game under desert stars, Delaney's hands steady on a rifle, Delaney's body unmoving in the sandstorm while Ethan had shouted promises too late. He heard it again now, as though the storm outside carried voices on its breath. "Don't let go this time. Don't fail her the way you failed me." He closed his eyes, exhaustion blurring the line between dream and memory. In that blurred space, he saw Delaney standing in the doorway of the cabin, his uniform dusty, his smile faint. "You've been carrying me too long," the apparition said. "Set it down. Save them, Ethan. Don't let the storm win again." Ethan startled awake with a shiver, realizing he had dozed, sitting up. The cloth in his hand had cooled, the lantern burned lower, and Grace's panting had grown shallower. Panic flickered, but then a small weight pressed against his wrist. Chance had climbed onto his arm, his head resting there with quiet determination. The pup gave a low whine, soft as a plea, and blinked up at him with trusting eyes. Ethan felt the sound like a hand against his chest. He ran his free hand down Chance's back, feeling the softness of fur over fragile bones. "You too? Huh? You're not going to let me drift off." Chance shifted, tucking himself closer. His heart beat quick and stubborn. Ethan smiled despite the heaviness in his chest. The pup's trust was absolute, undeserved, yet freely given. It tethered him to the present moment, a reminder that failure was not fate. It was choice. He rose slow from fatigue and moved to the stove. He poured warm water into a small bowl, mixing in a pinch of salt and broth from his last ration pack. Returning, he knelt and coaxed Grace's head up, letting her lap weakly at the liquid. She managed a few sips, then collapsed back, but her breathing steadied slightly. Ethan smoothed her fur, whispering, "That's it. One more breath, one more fight. We're not done." The hours bled together, each marked by his hand on Grace's chest, each broken by his quiet murmur of encouragement. When the fever surged, he wiped her brow. When she quieted, he whispered stories she couldn't understand, but might recognize and tone. The way Marines speak to each other when silence is too heavy. Chance never left his side, the small sentinel whose presence said what words could not. "Don't give up. We're here with you." By dawn, pale light leaked through the frosted window. Grace's breathing, though still labored, had lost its frantic edge. Her ears twitched faintly at the sound of Ethan's voice. Relief washed through him, leaving him drained but resolute. He sat back on his heels. Chance sprawled across his thigh, Grace's chest rising steady beneath his hand. In that moment, Ethan understood. Saving them was not a task he had stumbled into. It was a reckoning. Grace's struggle was his own, the fight to endure when storms threatened to erase everything. Chance's stubborn warmth was the reminder he had needed, that loyalty and love did not vanish even in the darkest places. Ethan leaned his head back against the log wall, closing his tired eyes, whispering one last promise before sleep finally claimed him. No more ghosts, not this time. The morning after Grace's fever broke, Helena looked deceptively calm beneath the weak sunlight. Icicles glittered from roof edges, and the sound of shovels clinking against sidewalks echoed faintly down Main Street. Yet beneath that veneer of quiet tension threaded through the town. Rumors had spread from Arthur Mill's mutterings and Clara's clinic to the gossiping tables of diners. A scarred German Shepherd and her pup had been pulled from the storm carrying the proof of a cruel secret long whispered but never confirmed. And if whispers had reached the townsfolk, they would surely have reached the man behind them. Calvin Hayes was known to many as the genial owner of Hayes's General Supply, a cluttered store on the south end of town that sold everything from work boots to fishing gear. He was in his early 50s, stocky with broad shoulders, softened by years of drink, his sandy hair now streaked with white and slicked back with too much pomade. His round face wore an easy smile for customers, but behind it sat small gray eyes that missed nothing. Those who had lived longest in Helena remembered a different Calvin once, a promising high school wrestler, hot-tempered and ambitious, until a bar fight in his 20s left another man permanently injured. Since then, he had traded discipline for influence, running his store as a front, and gathering men who preferred shadows over daylight. He was careful, though. Careful enough that the sheriff had never pinned anything on him. That morning, Calvin's patience snapped. Word of the injured German Shepherd had reached him through one of his lookouts. If the animal survived, it could lead the sheriff straight to his hidden camps. He dispatched 2 of his men, dressing them in second-hand jackets, stamped with the county's animal control insignia. One was a lanky man with a crooked nose named Rick Fowler, the other a younger recruit called Joel Myers, whose restless hands betrayed nerves he had never learned to master. "Bring the dogs back," Calvin ordered, his voice low but cutting. "No mistakes. And if the Marine gets in the way, remind him this isn't his war anymore." Meanwhile, at the clinic, Ethan Ward had spent the better part of the morning watching Grace sleep beside her pup in the recovery pen. Clara Whitmore moved quietly through the room, her slender frame swaying with practiced rhythm as she set fresh bandages and checked her charts. She carried herself with a calm that could soothe both animals and men, but today her expression was lined with unease. When the bell above the front door jingled, her hazel eyes flicked up. Two men stepped inside their county-issued jackets, zipped high badges gleaming, but something in their bearing was wrong. Clara had worked long enough with true animal control officers to recognize the difference. Those men carried the patience of handlers, the habit of crouching low and speaking soft. These two carried only arrogance, standing square with boots spread wide, scanning the room like hunters who had already claimed their prey. "We're here for the dogs," Rick announced, his crooked nose twitching as his gaze landed on Grace. His tone left no room for question. "Heard you've got strays picked up in the Storm County property." Now Ethan straightened from his crouch, his tall frame casting a long shadow across the clinic's linoleum floor. His steel-blue eyes locked on theirs, calm but unyielding. "County property?" he echoed, voice flat. "That's not what I see." Joel shifted uncomfortably under the weight of the Marine's gaze. Rick smirked, producing a clipboard. "Paperwork says otherwise, hand them over." Clara stepped forward, her cardigan pulled close around her. She was not tall, but there was authority in her voice when she said, "Strays are not. These animals are under medical care. They don't leave until I say so." Rick sneered, his crooked nose wrinkling. "Lady, you don't want to get in the middle of this." Ethan's hand brushed the pocket of his jacket where Clara had slipped a small recorder that morning, her whispered warning still fresh. "If Calvin shows his face, capture his words. They'll hang him faster than chains ever could." With one smooth motion, Ethan pressed the button, the tiny device humming to life unseen. "Funny thing," Ethan said, his voice dropping to the quiet cadence of a man used to negotiations in hostile territory. "County officers usually show identification." "Where's yours?" For a moment, silence cracked the room. Then Joel stammered, fumbling at his pocket before Rick shot him a glare. "We don't have to prove anything," Rick snapped. "You hand over the animals now or this gets ugly." Ethan's jaw tightened. "It already is." He moved toward Grace and Chance, scooping the pup into his arms and gesturing for Clara to open the pen. Grace struggled upright, her splinted leg trembling, but she leaned against Ethan's side with trust carved from fire. "Sheriff Pierce will want a word about this," Ethan said, his voice steady. Then he turned, ushering Clara behind him as he strode toward the back exit. Rick cursed under his breath, but something in the Marine's calm stare kept him from lunging forward. Once outside, Clara pressed a small bottle of pills into Ethan's free hand. "Painkillers," she said quickly, her voice low with urgency for her. "And remember, don't let Calvin's men corner you. He won't stop until those dogs are gone. Call Logan as soon as you can." Ethan nodded, his expression unreadable. He tucked the pills into his pocket, checked that the recorder was still running, and guided Grace and Chance toward the snow-laden street. His cabin lay miles away on the town's edge, through back roads still half buried from the storm. It would be a hard journey, but safer than leaving them in the open. They had barely cleared the alley when Grace stumbled, her breath rasping with effort. Ethan bent quickly, his strong arms scooping her up despite the strain it put on his shoulders. Chance wriggled from his coat, trotting at his boots, but the pup's injured hip betrayed him. He slipped into a drift, yelping as the snow swallowed him. Ethan dropped to his knees without hesitation, setting Grace gently down before plunging into the drift. He shoved aside the snow with bare hands, ignoring the sting of cold until he pulled Chance free. The pups shivered violently but wagged his tail the moment Ethan held him close. Relief washed over him, swift and sharp. He slung Chance back inside his coat, lifted Grace once more, and pushed onward into the storm's remnants. Behind them, Rick and Joel had slunked back to report their failure. And somewhere across town, Calvin Hayes lit a cigarette behind his store, the glow flaring against his smirk. He had underestimated the Marine, but he would not make that mistake again. The forest east of Helena was a cathedral of shadows. Snow lay thick on the branches, bending pines into arches, and the moon cut through gaps in silver shards. Ethan Ward moved carefully along a narrow trail, Grace limping close by, her breath puffing in quick clouds. Chance tucked inside his coat. Each crunch of boot on crusted snow echoed louder than it should have. He had learned long ago that silence in dangerous places was never empty. It was waiting. Ethan's instincts tightened. The back of his neck prickled the same way it had in Afghanistan before ambushes. He slowed his steel blue eyes, scanning the tree line. Grace halted too, her ears swiveling, despite her pain, a lowest growl rumbling from her chest. Then, as if the night itself had torn open, men stepped from the tree line. Calvin Hayes emerged first, his heavy frame draped in a fur-lined coat that looked too fine for the woods. His face wore its usual smug grin, but his gray eyes glittered with malice. Two of his men flanked him. Rick Fowler, tall and crooked-nosed, gripping a length of pipe, and Joel Myers, younger, jittery, carrying a flashlight that shook in his unsteady hands. Their boots scuffed the snow with practiced menace. Calvin's voice carried easily through the cold. "End of the line, Marine, you've got something of mine." He gestured with his chin toward Ethan's chest, where Chance wriggled faintly beneath the coat. Ethan straightened tall and steady, his lean build radiating calm, despite the tension. "They were never yours," he said evenly. His voice didn't rise. It cut through the night like a blade. Calvin's grin twisted. "Everything has an owner in this town, even strays. Hand over the pup, and maybe I let you walk away breathing." Before Ethan could answer, Rick lunged forward, hand outstretched to snatch Chance. Grace exploded upward with a bark that shook the trees, her broken leg dragging but her body propelled by sheer will. She collided with Rick's shin's teeth, bared a fury born of every lash and chain she had endured. Rick stumbled back with a curse, the pipe clattering from his hands. Ethan pivoted, shielding Chance with his arm, his other hand ready to strike. Joel froze, torn between fear and obedience. The flashlight beam jerking wildly across the snow. Calvin snarled, stepping forward himself, reaching for the coat where Chance was hidden. "Give him to me." Over my dead body, Ethan growled, and in his pocket, unseen, the small recorder Clara had given him hummed to life. The standoff might have broken into blood if not for the sudden chorus of voices and the snap of branches behind them. "Sheriff's Department, drop your weapons!" Flashlights flared through the trees, slicing the dark with beams of authority. Sheriff Logan Pierce led the way, his tall figure unmistakable. The Navy patrol uniform stark even under heavy winter gear. His calm gray-blue eyes took in the scene. In one sweep, his jaw set hard. Beside him moved two deputies, Sarah Whitaker, a ranger reassigned temporarily to assist the sheriff, lean and long-legged with auburn hair tied back in a no-nonsense braid, her green eyes sharp with focus. And Deputy Carl Jensen, a broad-shouldered man in his late 40s with a thick beard and a history as a logger before he joined law enforcement, his calm demeanor masking a strength that could break men in half. Logan's voice cut through the night. "Hayes. Fowler. Step back. Now." Calvin's grin faltered. "You've got no proof, but his anger betrayed him." He spat into the snow and shouted, Those dogs are mine. I paid for them. I trained them. I bled for this business, and no self-righteous Marine or sheriff is going to take it from me." His words rang out loud and vicious, captured perfectly by the recorder tucked in Ethan's pocket. Sarah raised her rifle, her voice steady. "You just gave us more than proof. You gave us your confession." Rick backed away, hands trembling, muttering curses under his breath. Joel dropped the flashlight entirely, his knees shaking as deputies moved to restrain him. Calvin, realizing too late, swung at Ethan in blind fury. But Grace leapt again, intercepting him with a snarl, her body a shield despite her pain. Calvin reeled back, slipping on the ice, and Logan was there in an instant. One gloved hand wrenching his arm behind his back, the other snapping cuffs with the efficiency of long practice. The forest exhaled. Snowflakes drifted down in slow spirals. And for a heartbeat all was still, except the panting of Grace in the muffled whine of chance. Ethan crouched, pulling Grace gently into his arms, whispering, "Easy, soldier. It's over now." Logan glanced at him, his calm eyes softening. "You did good, Ward. But next time leave the baiting to us." Ethan managed a tired smile. "Didn't plan it this way. They just don't like letting go." The deputies led Calvin and his men away. "Their curse is fading into the trees." Grace sagged against Ethan, her strength finally spent. Chance poked his head from the coat, his floppy ear drooping comically, and gave a small bark that sounded almost triumphant. Ethan looked down at them both, the soldier and the pup, and felt the weight of years lift slightly. In saving them, he had pulled himself out of the same chains that had bound his soul since the desert. And though the snow still covered Helena, he knew the darkness that had shadowed it was finally cracking. The weeks that followed blurred into a rhythm of healing and quiet vigilance. Helena, wrapped in its winter mantle, seemed gentler now, as though the forest itself had exhaled after the arrests. Snow still blanketed the hills, but it no longer felt like a shroud. In Ethan Ward's cabin on the outskirts, warmth had become a permanent resident. The wood stove glowed steadily, and laughter the kind he had not heard in years sometimes slipped through the door in the voices of neighbors who came to visit the two dogs that had in their way become the town's newest heroes. Grace had transformed. Her coat, once dull and ragged, now shone with a healthy sheen. Black saddle contrasting sharply with her tan chest and legs. The splint had come off weeks earlier, and though she carried a faint limp, she moved with confidence, her amber eyes alive and bright. She had learned to trust again, cautious at first, then more open, until one evening she surprised Ethan by resting her head on his lap without prompting. Chance, meanwhile, had grown into his paws, his floppy ears still refusing to stand, but adding a charm that endeared him to everyone he met. His hip healed cleanly, leaving him as rambunctious as any pup of 7 months darting through the snow with boundless energy. Ethan had built the McKenna in the yard, not as a cage, but as a sanctuary. Crafted from pine boards, he cut himself lined with wool blankets donated by Clara. The structure stood snug beneath the shadow of the cabin. Grace often chose the porch instead, her gaze sweeping the yard like a sentinel, but the kennel symbolized permanence, proof that they belonged. Not as strays, but as family. Clara went more visited often, her tall figure framed in her moss-green cardigan, arms full of supplies she insisted were leftovers, though Ethan suspected she bought them herself. She had seen countless animals cross her exam tables, yet Grace held a special place. Watching the shepherd's gentle nature emerge after such cruelty stirred something deep in her. She could be more than a survivor. Clara remarked one morning as Grace nosed gently at a visiting veteran's hand, she could help others. Therapy work, maybe. Soldiers like you." Her hazel eyes softened as she met Ethan's steady gray-blue gaze. With time, she could heal more than just herself. Ethan didn't answer right away. He had never thought of dogs beyond loyalty and survival. Comrades and a different skin. But as he watched Grace lean into the veteran's touch, her tail thumping softly, he realized Clara was right. Grace's story wasn't just hers. It was a lifeline for others still trapped in storms of their own. Chance, on the other hand, became the town's delight. Children stopped by daily, bundled in coats and scarves to toss sticks into the snow and laugh as the pup bounded after them. His clumsy leaps often ended in spectacular tumbles, sending up fountains of powder, but he always returned triumphant, eyes shining with mischief. Even the gruffest of Helena's old-timers found themselves chuckling at his antics. Arthur Mills, the stocky old logger, declared that Pup's got more fight in him than any man I've seen, though his eyes softened every time Chance licked his weathered hands. For Ethan, these weeks felt like a thaw. The ghosts of Afghanistan no longer prowled his nights so fiercely. Delaney's voice still lingered in dreams, but it was gentler now, less accusing, as if approving of the life Ethan was building. Each morning, as he stepped onto his porch with a cup of black coffee and watched Grace and Chance chase each other across the yard, he felt the ache in his chest shift into something else, something closer to peace. One morning stood out above all others. The sun rose over Helena in a blaze of gold, scattering light across the snow until the whole valley seemed to glow. Ethan sat on the porch steps, boots planted in the powder, watching Grace and Chance tumble in the yard. A group of neighborhood children had joined them, their laughter carrying clear in the crisp air. Grace moved slowly but playfully, bowing her head to let the children drape scarves around her neck, while Chance darted between them like a comet, ears flopping wildly. Ethan leaned back, his breath fogging in the cold, a rare smile softening the weathered lines of his face. In their joy, he saw echoes of something he had thought forever lost: a family's warmth, the simple trust of belonging. For the first time in years, he believed that storms, no matter how brutal, could give way to dawn. And as the morning light spilled across his cabin over the children, and over the 2 German shepherds who had survived both chains and snow, Ethan whispered words only the wind could hear. "You brought me home." In the end, this story is not only about a soldier, a mother, dog, and her pup. It is a reminder that even in the fiercest storms, love can be stronger than chains, and grace can rise from suffering. Some would call it chance, but many would call it a miracle. A quiet gift from God, showing us that He still works through the loyalty of animals and the courage of people. In our daily lives, we all face storms of our own. Some are loud, some are silent, but all of them test the strength of our hearts. The lesson here is simple yet powerful. Never give up on love. Never give up on mercy, because even the smallest act of kindness can be the answer to someone's prayer. If this story touched your heart, I invite you to share it with others who may need hope. Leave a comment below. Write Amen if you believe in miracles, and let us pray together that God continues to bless and protect everyone who watches these stories. And if you want to walk with us on more journeys of faith, hope, and loyalty, remember to subscribe to this channel. May God bless you always.